Today we're going to cover the top 5 opening traps and attacking patterns in the Queen's Gambit. It could be that you wish to play the pawn move, Queen's pawn move, pawn to d4 yourself, and for sure you gotta be aware of these traps so that you know how to face them when you're playing black. And surely the first one is the most classical Queen's Gambit trap, gambiting this pawn on c4. Not many players know that you can use it both as white and as black, which I'm going to cover in a minute. Now, if black decides to accept the gambit, you then play pawn e3, aiming to get it back. And it's strange that this trap is really old, and yet it's still, up to this day, one of the most common for black to play pawn to b5, trying to hold on to this pawn, which is wrong because then you play a4, trying to split up these pawns and pick them up, and he can't go a6. After that, if you trade off pawns, that hands rook for black at the end of the line, therefore they can't defend their pawn that way. Let's take it back a couple moves, and if they want to maintain their pawn chain, they only have the option of playing pawn to c6. And then if you trade pawns, at first it seems that like black succeeding in holding on to their extra pawn, but it's a false thing because, that's actually the main trap of the Queen's Gambit. You play queen f3, attacking this rook on the corner of the board, and strangely enough, black can't avoid material losses. It is equally strange that not many players realize that you can use the exact same trap playing black. When your opponent goes pawn d4, you can bait him to accept this gambit pawn by playing pawn to c5, and if he captures it, you can then play pawn to e6, pretending like you just want to get your pawn back. If he wants to hold on to this pawn and plays pawn b4, you undermine it. If he wants to maintain the pawn chain, he goes pawn c3. It's all the same stuff with reversed color. You play queen f6, and he can't avoid material losses. He'll either sacrifice the rook or he'll have to give up the knight. Either way, you gotta win a material advantage. It is more solid for black to maintain the center by playing pawn to e6, but you still have some interesting attacking options here. So after you develop your knight and your opponent does the same, you can trade in the middle of the board and follow up with bishop to g5. That already creates some pressure. As you eliminate the knight, the defender of the central pawn, you can then possibly pick up this undefended pawn with your knight, so black already needs to be careful. If let's say he defends it with a pawn, then you also play pawn to e3, black goes bishop to e7, and there is a little nuance that's just worth knowing for white. It may be tempting to just play knight f3, play the most standard move ever, and there's nothing wrong with playing this move, but as you do that, you let your opponent to bring their bishop out to an active square, either it would be g4 or maybe f5 where it controls this diagonal. And so instead, what white does here, instead of development of the knight, white plays a more sophisticated move queen to c2, which is much trickier. So from here, it takes away the f5 square, therefore your opponent can no longer place his bishop there. Also, placing his bishop to g4 is something they won't really do, as it attacks emptiness here, and you can attack it from here in different ways, so they won't develop the bishop there. And so queen c2 is kind of already starts creating some little troubles for black. Plus, if he castles, you can always play bishop d3, and although it's not the end of the world, still it feels like you put some pressure on black along this diagonal, and it starts getting slightly unpleasant. In the current game we're analyzing, was played between two grandmasters, Trugubov against Geller, and black played knight h5, trying to trade off this active bishop. It's a nice idea generally speaking, but after this trade on e7, white shocked black by knight takes d5. All of a sudden, white just wins the pawn, attacks this queen on e7, and the idea is that if the pawn captures, this actually hands this bishop on c8, so queen takes c8 comes with a check, and it's a complete devastation of black. After a queen covers the king, you can go queen takes b7, attack the rook, you threaten bishop b5, checking the king, this pawn on d5 is also weak, and you just gain a significant winning material advantage. In the next game, black decided that since he can't develop his bishop to f5 because white queen controls this square, he decided to bring his bishop out to g4 nevertheless, even though white does not have a knight there, but black hopes that sooner or later white will play it and it will transpose into a more standard position. But white also used a really tricky plan here. Instead of bringing the knight out, he just played bishop d3, pretending like he's simply developing pieces. Black did the same, and then h3 attacks the bishop, black played it back to h5, and here white took advantage of the fact that their knight is not there on f3 and the f-pawn is free to move forward, so he played pawn f4. Strangely enough, it turns out that this bishop is nearly captured. Black tried to escape with the bishop g6, trying to trade it off, but white shuts down the position with f5, bishop has to go back, and now white could play g4 and just win the bishop straight away. He decided to be even safer, he played bishop f4. It turns out that black can't stop g4 from coming anyway. He played g6, but of course white does not want to trade. He played g4, the bishop was trapped, So black took here, white won the bishop, and on the next move black resigned. Remarkably, this is the game between two grandmasters, so you see it's really not easy for black to get away from your attack if you know all these attacking patterns. In the next example, black tried to counterattack. So initially it was all the same stuff. White traded on d5, played bishop g5 to establish a pin here and to put some pressure on d5. Black covered it, white played pawn to e3, and black decided, you know what, I'm sick and tired of you putting pressure on me all the time, I want to counterattack. And he played queen to b6, aiming at this pawn on b2. But white still played the same move, queen c2, but that white wanted to play anyway. And now black realized that this knight is hanging, white still wants to play bishop d3, put pressure here, so somehow if black wants to counterattack, he's got to do something like more active. And he decided to play knight e4, attacking this bishop. Now of course white can trade there and actually win a pawn on e4, but black was fine with that. He realized that after bishop e6, this pawn on b2 is hanging, plus maybe some bishop b4 goes to attack the king, and therefore black has some attacking options here. On top of that, black even has the idea of playing queen a5 with an attack of the king and the bishop. So black has a bunch of attacking options here. Now what do? Well, white stayed cool and just developed, knight f3. Black took the pawn on b2, attacking the rook, but rook can go to b1 and counterattack the queen. Notice that the rook is defended, therefore black can't take it. He played queen to c3. And white played a bold move, king to d1. He said, I don't want to move my knight back, I want to stay active, and I'm just okay with this position. Even though white's king is centralized, but there aren't many pieces that can possibly attack it besides this queen on c3, and also there are many defenders around the king, so white is actually safe. And black also has to address this threat of rook takes b7. Black decided to just go knight d7 and develop pieces, and white played bishop d3. Which also was an interesting move, developing a bishop, possibly preparing to regroup with king e2 followed by rook to c1, which would like activate all of white's pieces. And black decided that like he wants to get rid of all these annoying pieces of white and played pawn to h6, which turned out to be a deadly error, because in addition to rook takes b7 threat, it turned out that white has a shocking tactics queen takes e6, sacrificing the queen, because in the next move it follows up with a really rare and beautiful checkmate by two bishops. The next game, once again, played between two grandmasters, Benoni against Smirnov. Here black decided to play more aggressively and says, hey, you want to pin my knight? Let me do the same to you. He played bishop b4. But the problem for black is that after knight f3 and after a couple moves, white is going to castle, which will move his king away from this pin, therefore the bishop on b4 will become a useless piece, while your own pin on his knight is actually something unpleasant. So bishop b4 is a double-edged thing, and there are some disadvantages of that as well. Anyway, black decided to take this gambit pawn right now, but white continued with pawn to e4. This time the knight is pinned and white is coming up with pawn e5, attacking it. Therefore black decided to play h6 and do something about that. White traded on f6, and now got back his gambit pawn with bishop takes c4. Black decided to counter-strike in the center, because otherwise white has these beautiful pawns in the middle of the board. He's ready to castle, moving his king away from this pin, and all in all, white will just have a big positional advantage. Therefore, black decided to play c5, trying to somehow still counter-attack, cross d4, maybe c3 with the queen and bishop, trying to create some threats. But white is overpowering black simply because he has more pieces in the game. So he played e5, kicking off this queen. Black returned it back to its starting square, and white castled. Notice that white has basically finished his development, he's ready to attack, while for black there are still a couple more moves that he needs to play in order to bring his pieces into play. Black wanted to trade off some material, but white played a tricky move. Instead of trying to recapture on d4, which may allow black to trade off some of the pieces or to trade off the bishop, he actually played a sneaky move knight to e4. So that the bishop is now completely useless on b4, it can't even take the knight. And our knight on e4 is an excellent piece. It aims at these squares, and in the long run you can jump to one of these squares and to start your massive attack. Nevertheless, black just castled, and white played queen e2. So you want to bring the rook on d1, which white did on the next move, and then to take back this pawn in a comfortable situation where all of your pieces are on their maximum active squares. Black played queen b6 because he was probably annoyed by the fact that the rook x-raised the queen. Now white got back his pawn and black countered with rook to d8. Perhaps he thought that he's creating some threats here, but white just ignored that and played queen g4. Now the king is somewhat weak and white is threatening with all kinds of knight to f6 check things. Black took on d4, white recaptured, and possibly at this point black realizes that he can't really take there, that would lose material. Queen takes d4, loses the queen after knight f6, check to the king, and on the next move you can win the queen. So it's really tricky. I mean, of course, like the exact same moves may not occur in your games, but it just goes to show like common attacking patterns of white in this position. Black instead decided to play knight c6, and it seems like the position is still complicated. Black is attacking this rook, also the pawn. From there the knight will attack the queen and the bishop. It looks very complex, but white still ignored all of his threats and said, you know what, I'm the one attacking, and he played knight f6 check. The pawn on g7 is pinned down to the king, therefore it can't move. If black recaptures with the bishop, that's still pretty cool, because you recapture threatening queen takes g7 checkmate. That's still bad for black. Therefore, instead in the game black played king to f8, probably still hoping that the position is complex, white is attacking, but also the knight is hanging, the rook is hanging, the pawn is hanging, like seems very complex. But white said no, it's not all that complex at all, because after queen takes g7, it turned out that white wins the game in style. After king takes, rook to g4, check to the king, and whether the king goes to h8 or f8 doesn't matter, because on the next move white finishes it off with rook to g8 checkmate. And here's a puzzle of the day for you. Does white to play and win? And if you can find the winning continuation for white, please write it down in the comments below. And by the way, this position also arose from the Queen's Gambit. And today we covered more of a traps and tactical patterns, but if you want to just understand the Queen's Gambit, I've got another video which is a quick crash course explaining all the fundamental ideas, plans in the Queen's Gambit, and I'm sure that after watching it, a lot of things will be much clearer for you. So if you're curious, you can click this video and check it out.